Welcome to People of Yes. We are the 5th of August, 2014. Today it is our privilege to interview Dr. George Patterson, world-renowned authority on church multiplication, the original author of the widely acclaimed Train and Multiply program, numerous books, and countless articles. Well, Dr. Patterson, you have been training for years for many denominations, almost all biblically oriented theological backgrounds, yet there's a much of your training that many find so biblical that they're able to apply it in their ministries. One of the sources for your understanding that you have cited is the Wesleyan movement in Britain of over 150 years ago. I wonder if you could share with us today some of the dynamics and the disciplines of the Wesleyan movement that you find are still applicable to wherever churches are multiplying today.
Well, I'm glad you asked me that, Dr. Cura, because just a few months ago I gave a forum to a group of Wesleyan leaders in the holiness churches in Cincinnati, and the forum was to help them start a second track of truly Wesleyan churches that were small enough to just continue multiplying like rabbits. In the process, I did a lot of research. I studied how Wesley got the tiny little class meetings, he called them, to multiply rapidly with a strong focus on Christ. And that furnished the foundation historically for the evangelical movement. All of the great church planting movements that are taking place around the world today, they have their root in the beginning of the evangelical movement that Wesley and his co-workers set the guidelines for.
Okay, you mentioned these guidelines. Could you explain to us what some of those were that you find still highly applicable?
Well, they're all thoroughly New Testament. They're things that Christ or his apostles required of the churches. One thing is Wesley kept the little class meetings tiny. He recommended 6 to 8 adults. 12 was the absolute limit because he found that you go beyond that, you cannot sustain the intense interaction that the New Testament requires. At that size, the groups are very healthy because everyone takes part and participates, and they can multiply rapidly, just like rabbits. That's one of the dynamics. Another one is transparency. Wesley had the leaders set the pace. The main leader would start the meeting out by confessing his own sins, the things he'd committed during the week, to set the pace for the rest. And they needed that because he was getting people right out of the world. These were not Christians being reformed. These were drunkards and adulterers and so forth. A lot of them were very uncouth and uneducated minors and so forth. Wesley brought them together, and in that context, they were comfortable in confessing with total transparency their sins and their needs and having tremendously meaningful fellowship in Christ.
You said that there were leaders in some of these class meetings, as they were called. How did Wesley identify such leaders? How did he form or train them for their role?
Well, the meetings themselves were kept very small, as I said, and so normally they just centered around a family or maybe 2 or 3 families. The leaders were laymen, and they were being mentored by more experienced leaders in the same movement. John expected every head of a family to shepherd their own family, starting the day they received Christ.
Continue along the line of the disciplines that you talk about. What were those rustic new believers being taught to do?
Well, the very word Methodist came from the Oxford Holy Club, and it meant not Bible message only, but Bible method. And by that, they meant strictly adhering to the practices that Christ and the apostles required. There's not much emphasis on the hierarchical clergy, on the big institutions. It was kept very simple. These men who were leaders were bi-vocational, that is, self-supported, and they were just common people, just ordinary laymen, but they were appointed as shepherds, lay pastors.
Well, what made these class meetings so replicable? How was it that they came to multiply?
The biggest reason, or strongest reason for that is that Wesley did not require anything that Christ and the apostle did not require. So they didn't need to build a building. They didn't need to have budgets. They just let it happen. And their strong, intense focus on Christ and being born again. And they were very patient with people who had a lot of sin in their lives. And their meetings were very comfortable for someone who's had a drinking problem or other things like that. For them to come to the meeting, they were not rejected. They really found Christ in a loving atmosphere.
How much of this was actually transferable when the Wesleyan movement made the leap from Britain over to and across North America?
Well, for the first century and a half or so, they pretty much followed Wesley's guidelines, but then the churches of that persuasion began to become more like the other denominations, and they lost a lot of those dynamics. They became institutional churches. But the dynamics that I mentioned, they did bring across the ocean with them, and the churches did multiply rapidly. The training came from mentoring from more experienced leaders. They had what they called field preaching, which simply meant to do your evangelism outside of any church building. Get out with the people or take the church to them. Don't expect them to come to church. You take the church to them. They also required all of the believers to be very active, and they dealt with this in every meeting. They planned who they were going to evangelize during the week. They did a lot of social work, mercy ministry, that sort of thing too. In other words, the groups were highly active. The early Methodist churches in the United States kept those dynamics very well.
Could you offer 2 or 3 guidelines from the Wesleyan movement that you would recommend wherever ministries today want to see their churches multiply in the same way?
One is to obey Jesus Christ and above and before all else. Obey his commands, know what they are, and from the very beginning, day one of a new church, you covenant together to just do what Jesus said to do. Another one is don't worry about money. Don't do things that are expensive. So that way the movement, the expansion, is not limited by a finite source of funds. Another thing is to let all people who God's gift to be a leader, let them lead. Let them lead. Don't limit it to people that meet certain academic requirements. Above all, that passion to win souls for Christ.
Well, Dr. Patterson, thank you for these insights. Many are going to act on them and bear great fruit. Can we have you on again soon?
Well, I hope so. Thank
right.
you very much.
See you again. Bye.
Bye.